Welcome to Europe Explained, brought to you by the Council of Europe. This podcast series offers a unique window into what we are doing to create a fairer, more democratic Europe. Through conversations with experts and frontline workers, we bring you closer to the issues that matter, from fighting discrimination to upholding human rights, from defending democracy to building laws, systems and institutions that are just, fair and open to all. Hello and welcome to Europe Explained, the Council of Europe podcast that offers you a window into our world. I'm your host, Cathie Burton, and today we'll be delving into an issue critical for democracy and media freedom across Europe. Strategic lawsuits against public participation, commonly known as SLAPPS, and they're a form of legal intimidation increasingly used by the powerful to shut down discussion on matters they would rather not be in the public domain. It's particularly worrying in the way they're affecting journalists' ability to investigate and expose wrongdoing, but they are also being used to target NGOs and activists. With the dangers to our democracies very apparent, the Council of Europe is taking a special interest, and that's why I'm glad to welcome some of the people most qualified to guide us through the issue today. So Matthew Caruana Galizia, you're the director of the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation, and you're a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has devoted himself to the cause of journalist safety following the murder of your mother back in Malta in 2017. We have with us also Sarah Clarke from Article 19, the Freedom of Expression NGO. You're involved in CASE, C-A-S-E, and that's a coalition of concerned NGOs from across Europe. And Flutura Kusari, you're senior legal advisor at the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, at the forefront of supporting the hundreds of media workers across Europe who are affected by these issues. And you're co-leading the anti-SLAPP work both at the European Union and the Council of Europe. So I'm going to turn to Sarah first. Sarah, I know that your organisation is supporting many of the victims of SLAPPS, but, for somebody on the outside, it's a very complex issue. Can you tell us a little bit about which laws are being used and abused and how they're being used and abused in different ways?
Sure. Thanks, Cathie. What we see is across the Council of Europe region, the abuse of legal systems with the aim to shut down criticism and silence dissenting voices. We see in particular the abuse of defamation, so both criminal defamation, which is unfortunately still very widespread across the region, but also increasingly the abuse of civil defamation by individual actors. So in the private law context, where businessmen, oligarchs, politicians routinely take cases against their critics, not with the aim to win the cases, but really to drag the critic through the process, a punishing process, with the aim of silencing them, isolating them, intimidating them, and the real purpose is to shut down investigations and criticism of those individuals.
So it's a kind of form of bullying, really. These people are being bullied into submission. Very often, journalists who might not earn very much money or individuals who are activists just being crushed by powerful organisations.
Absolutely. It's truly legal bullying at its height. And unfortunately, we see whole industries spreading which facilitate this. So we have reputation management groups and organisations who really facilitate and earn an awful lot of money from being involved in this legal bullying.
And you're supporting journalists who are now involved in these cases. Could you tell us a little bit about how that's evolving and what you're seeing?
Yeah, so as the CASE Coalition, we support all individuals targeted by SLAPPS. So the vast majority of SLAPPS are still taken against journalists and media outlets, but we also see a lot of SLAPPS against environmental defenders and other watchdogs. We see academics who are taken to court for the research that they're trying to publish, and other activists and protesters. So the CASE Coalition supports those victims or targets of SLAPPS through our advocacies. We publish statements about their cases. We call for those cases to be dropped. We also fund, through Flutura's organisation, the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, we fund the legal defence of those targets of SLAPPS. At a regional level, we've been fighting really hard to change the laws to prevent this abuse. So here at the Council of Europe, we've been fighting for a robust anti-SLAPP recommendation. And in Brussels, we've been fighting for a robust anti-SLAPP directive. We've had some really good gains recently, including in the United Kingdom, where we've seen the first piece of legislation that would prevent SLAPPS in the context of economic crimes from going through the courts. And that's what we really want to work on now is legal reform across the bloc.
So I want to turn now to Matthew, because you really have been on the difficult end of this. Sadly, the story of what happened to your mother has brought this to the forefront. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened and what subsequent moves you made to try and protect journalists?
So when I was a kid, what would normally happen was that people would set fire to the front door of our house, say, or slit our dog's throat. And these are very Mediterranean ways of sending warnings, let's say, by organized criminal groups. But interestingly, I mean, as Malta developed, so did the criminals. I mean, they learned how to use a knife and fork and put on a suit and tie, and how to sue journalists for defamation as well. So that's around the time I think the majority of the cases started. Post-EU membership, the country was being flooded with foreign investment and business was booming, which is fantastic. But the country was just simply not equipped to deal with the crime that also came with it. The institutions just weren't up to scratch. I mean, there was no enforcement of any kind. Also, there was just simply a lack of respect for human rights, especially free expression. It just wasn't a part of the culture. My mother defied that as a personality. She was just born that way, and also formed as well by her upbringing. She just really wasn't afraid to speak out, and the more people tried to shut her up, the more she felt that she had to speak out. I think around 2013, that's when the cases really started to increase. We had a change in government. On the one hand, introduced a lot of changes that were sort of welcomed by liberal wings, such as civil marriage, divorce legislation, and so on, but was also anti-democratic in many other respects. The government, we saw afterwards, really encouraged its supporters, financial and otherwise, to go after my mother. She was a critic of government and the connections with Malta's business elite, irrespective of whoever was in government. And this is, I think, what primarily made her so popular.
I remember one thing that really shocked me was to hear that after her death, you and your family had to take on those 47 defamation cases.
It was just a moment where, I don't know, you've probably seen the cartoons, right? The Road Runner. And there are those scenes in the cartoon where Wile E. Coyote is just running after the Road Runner, and suddenly the road just runs out. He looks down and there's nothing below him, and he just falls down. That is the feeling I had about democracy in Europe and Malta in general. I assumed that we were working within a given framework, but at that moment, when I realized we inherited all the cases, it's like I just looked down and the foundations of democracy were no longer there. I obviously couldn't believe it, neither could my brothers, that the cases would go on after my mother's murder. That before we even got to bury what was left of her, we were going to have to be in court to defend the cases that were filed against her. And these were no ordinary cases. They were filed by cabinet ministers who were still in government. I mean, really serious. There was a huge intimidating effect. When we were in the courtroom, I mean, the atmosphere was just deathly silenced. You could tell that even the magistrates were uncomfortable with the cases that were before them. They simply felt intimidated. It was, yes, a complete shock. First the murder and then the defamation cases. that was when we decided enough, we have to do something about this at a European level.
So that's powered your drive to stand up for investigative journalism, stand up for free journalism and work against SLAPPS.
100%, but there's also a fear that democracy in Europe is really kind of sort of hanging in there. And I really see journalism is long past its sort of golden age, so to speak, in the industry. But we are in sort of a new age of innovation in journalism. And journalists have become, in many cases, even more effective than the authorities such as the police or investigating magistrates or anyone like that at investigating cross-border crime. But this, of course, has put them at massive risk. I mean, they are very exposed. In countries like Malta, where it's just journalists like my mother investigating these sorts of crimes, they are highly, highly exposed. My mother was targeted because she was the only person doing anything about high-level corruption. It wasn't a magistrate, it wasn't a prosecutor, it wasn't a judge, it wasn't any police officer who was targeted. It was a journalist, my mother. She was the only person doing anything about high-level corruption. But of course, her situation is not unique. There are other journalists in Europe in the same situation. And if we lose those people due to defamation proceedings, they simply decide to check out and there's no one to replace them, it means the watchdog role is just not there in many European countries. And I think that this makes it a national security concern above all else. I mean, powerful European governments form policy with respect to other political actors or economic actors thanks to the information that they have at their disposal. That information comes primarily from journalists. So there, I think, it becomes a matter of national security.
Yes, that's true. It's a real threat to democracy if journalists themselves are threatened. And I think it's very interesting to see how the Council of Europe, or indeed the European Union, can take an international stand. Although, you've spoken about Malta, all the same, every single country is affected by this. And I want to turn to Flutura now because it's obvious in a way that this has to be tackled at European level. And you've been deeply involved in that work. So can you explain a little bit about what moves are being made to stop this abuse?
So what we've done in the last 5-6 years since Matthew Caruana Galizia was assassinated was to document SLAPPS so that we could prove, especially to legislators and policymakers, that this is a European problem. And I think we've succeeded in that after so many years of research and work. So currently we have 2 international institutions, organizations working on setting up standards on anti-SLAPP. It's the European Commission and the Council of Europe. So by end of this year, most likely we'll have the first European standards on anti-SLAPP. We'll have a European Union directive, which is mandatory piece of legislation for member states. And we will have a Council of Europe recommendation, which is still a recommendation, but we know from the past experience that it can be very powerful in guiding member states to legislate, regulate SLAPPS. What these institutions have done is they've set up 2 groups of experts. Most of us have served in both groups where we advised the institutions how to tackle SLAPPS. And now we have a draft recommendation, not to be very detailed and technical. So now we're waiting the next 3-4 months to be adopted by Council of Europe, a final adaptation. And we're also waiting from the European Commission by end of June to have the directive. By the way, we're calling the directive of the EU Daphne's Law, because it was inspired by her work and what happened to her, but also because Vera Jourova, the commissioner, who was very friendly and very good in collaborating with civil society, she promised to Daphne's family that she will deliver on anti-SLAPP, and that she did. So for us is the passing of Daphne's Law and also the Council of Europe recommendation. Now we will have the standards, but that's just the start of the work, because it will be about implementation. And I think implementation will depend directly from political will. So you always have countries which are more willing to implement recommendations so that human rights are guaranteed and protected. But you also have challenging countries which are not very much willing. I think for us, and we mentioned this during today's discussion, is the key point is collaboration with civil society. Sometimes you can have governments which are willing to implement instruments, but they rush so much and they don't include civil society groups, so that in the end we end up with a very bad outcome, which can do more damage compared to not having at all legislation. We're really advocating that member states, governments, parliaments do consider the recommendation from civil society national level and work together to come up with solutions.
So we've got real big milestones coming there, something that could really change the situation. But it's a matter really of making that law become practice and spreading that practice throughout the whole of Europe and elsewhere.
It's a complex matter legally, but maybe to clarify for your listeners, what we're aiming to achieve is at least three things. First, to have some legal mechanism which will enable courts to quickly dismiss cases. Now, we do understand that everyone who is subject to a reporting, to public participation, has the right to access courts, and we do respect that, of course. But what we're trying to achieve is that if, for example, Matthew is sued by a business person, and then he asks 1 million euros for an article, then the court to be able to quickly dismiss the case if the case is SLAPP. Secondly, we want to have some indicators that help judges to identify a SLAPP. It's not always easy. It's very complex. With the draft recommendation, there is a list of indicators which hopefully will help judges and other competent authorities to identify a SLAPP. And lastly is the support. It was mentioned by Sarah and also Matthew how important it is for the SLAPP victims and targets to be supported. And civil society support is never ever enough. It cannot replace state support. So the idea is that member states facilitate, organize together with other non-state actors, financial support, legal support, and other practical support. So all these elements are in both instruments. In the draft recommendation, you have them in more elaborative way. But if we have both instruments in place, which are complementary to each other, I think we should be happy that some standards will be there, and then it's up to member states.
So it's a question of having the hard law there and making sure that then everybody understands it, sees the reason why it's there, supports journalism for democracy as well.
What we're advocating for are very fundamental protections for free speech. There is no requirement that you are a journalist, work as a journalist, practice journalism in order to be protected. The kind of protections that we're asking for aim to protect anyone who is engaging in a matter of public interest, whether you're an academic, a politician, an activist, a journalist, whoever you may be. These protections are really important for everyone.
And Sarah, I wanted to ask you, you're supporting a lot of these people. Do you think these new advances will be a help to your cause?
Absolutely. I think they're the foundation of the changes, but we're also looking at cultural change. So there's the hard law changes, and then there are softer regulatory changes. So, for example, we've had a brilliant reform in the UK of the Solicitors Regulatory Authority. So they can now issue warning notices that put lawyers on notice if they're seen as engaging in SLAPPS. We'd like to see a lot more of that across the bloc. So we'd like to see legal regulatory bodies engaging with this issue. A huge part of the work of Case, of Matthew and of other, because Matthew himself has faced SLAPPS. It's not just Matthew's mum, but that whole community of people who've been targeted by SLAPPS. We're really trying to ensure that those stories are being heard, that the public are aware of these cases. And some of those cases have really come to light in the last couple of years. Again, in the UK, in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you had a number of key oligarchs slapping renowned journalists. In Italy, we have some of the most famous journalists in Italy are being slapped by the Prime Minister. We see some huge examples there. And so the public is increasingly sensitive that this is indeed a huge issue. It's a huge issue for democracy, for security, and for the ability of the public to access that information, for the public's right to know. Because that's the whole point of SLAPPS, is to shut down this really crucial information. So I think those are the really important parts. So we have legislative reform and cultural change.
So hopefully what we've done today, our podcast, will be able to get this story out to the public. So thank you very much to my guest today. And this brings us to the end of this episode of Europe Explained. I'm Cathie Burton, and today we've been looking at the complex world of SLAPPS and uncovering their impact on journalism and on the democratic process. Special thanks to all of our guests, and looking forward to seeing you again. If you enjoyed this discussion and wish to explore more topics, be sure to check out our other episodes of Europe Explained. You can also learn more about the Council of Europe and its initiatives at our website, www.coe.int. And don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates and insights. You can find us on X, LinkedIn, Facebook and Instagram.